What's going on? I'm AnokhiTheOne, and I'm back with another video, and this video is about the 5 books that set me free from white supremacy. First, let's define what white supremacy is, because some of you will be like, well, what the hell are you talking about? So white supremacy is very basic. It is the idea that white people are supreme. And basically all people are white supremacists by default until you do the actual work to dismantle that. You have to, because it comes in so many different forms, right? A lot of black people are white supremacists. I'm telling you, in business. Oh my God. Okay. Just period. So how to dismantle? How did I start to dismantle it? Because like I said, we were all white supremacists by default. So the first thing, I mean, like I said, reading is huge. And one of the first books that I read that kind of blew the lid off for me is a book called They Came Before Columbus.
Is known as Olmec civilization. This civilization occurs in the Gulf Coast of Mexico. When we speak of Mexico, however, you must get it very clear in your mind that we're not speaking of the shrunken Mexico of today. We speak of Mexico when it was the very core and heartland of Native American civilizations. A Mexico that included parts of Colorado, parts of Texas, parts of California, going right up to La Plata in Canada. This civilization, known as Olmec, was to touch all other civilizations in America. The Maya, the Toltec, the Aztec, etc. It was even to stretch right out into South America. What is very unusual about this civilization was that not only was it the mother of American civilizations, but it contained elements that were not just native to America, but was a fusion between the Native American and people coming from outside. The most significant of those outsiders were the Africans. We have very clear evidence in stone heads, in terracottas that are clay sculptures, as well as skulls and skeletons of an African physical type entering that native population, somewhere between 948 and 680 BC.
These huge statues in the Gulf of Mexico, humongous, with Negroid features, all right? And they're finding all these artifacts, okay? And all this evidence that people that look like me were in the Americas thousands, hundreds of thousands of years before Columbus, right? And so as an American person, an American black person, that just made me think like, wow, okay, that means I could have been here before Columbus, like my ancestors could have been here, which they were. But yeah, so that just made me go down the rabbit hole, because that's one layer of white supremacy that makes us believe that, which is Pan-Africanism, that just like debunked Pan-Africanism for me, because it made it, Pan-African makes it seem like the only way a black person can go anywhere besides Africa, or has in the past gone anywhere besides Africa, is through the hands of white men and through slavery. It, like, they were literally packaged up by white people and they were brought to these other places. That is white supremacy, because it's basically what you're saying is black people did not have the wherewithal, they didn't have the knowledge, the skills, or the resources to get to America on their own. For thousands of, really? For hundreds of thousands of years? You have to be a white supremacist to even believe that that even makes sense, right? When black people have covered the earth since the beginning of time, that makes absolutely no sense. If you believe in Pangea, that everything broke off and the original person in the Americas was a black woman, which is what they tell us, right? And they had all kinds of different communities all over the world, and when it broke off, those people just stayed where they was at. And those people were dark-skinned, it makes absolutely no sense, right? And even then, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, Egyptians, they've been traveling the entire world, okay? And they were black. But not even just Egyptians. All kinds of races of people have been all over the world forever, right? So that is just like a mind-blowing thing, because no matter if you say, oh, you know, my ancestors are French, people are going to assume that your ancestors were white. When there are French people in friends right now who are my skin color and darker, right? And been there forever, right? If you say my ancestors were Canadian, which they were, you're gonna think I'm talking about a white person. But there's black people there right now. If I say my ancestors are from the UK or from Spain or from Italy, even though Italy is literally a hop and a skip away from Africa, you're gonna assume that they were white. That is white supremacy. And it's not true, right? Because they could very well have been my complexion, right? Even if I said Ireland, there are black people in Ireland right now, right? I think y'all get my point. So that just really just like boof was a explosion that kind of broke away white supremacy in my mind. So white cargo, and you can get this on Amazon right now. Basically, the original slaves that came to America were white. They were English. They were English people. So they brought their own people here. 2/3 of the original colony were slaves.
As we began to investigate this, and we used all the kind of resources that investigators do, we look at every kind of book, every kind of official report, etc., diaries, letters, we realised it was an enormous story, and it was also something which refuted one of the great ideas of, well, one of the key ideas of the development of slavery, which is that in 1619 slavery began in America with the arrival of 20 and odd Negroes, as they were called, sold, according to accounts, by a Dutch captain to planters in England, and this was where slavery began. Well, it wasn't true. Slavery had begun earlier. Children and women and convicts had been sold earlier than that, and although a small number of Africans were subsequently brought to Virginia and sold over the next decades, only very few, only 350 years later. Oh, sorry, 20 years later. But meantime, hundreds, thousands of poor whites were being brought in, and on various convicts and children, etc., and they were being enslaved.
Those were the original slaves, and those were the majority of the slaves early on in the colonies, right? And I would say all throughout history, the history of America, they have been the majority of the slave immigrants, right? Even in the 1800s when they had Europeans coming in droves, right? Like, y'all don't know about this, right? You think somebody came from the Soviet Union, like, for example, Gary Vee's people, or even Trump's people, they came from like somewhere in Germany, right? There's people coming from all over the world, and they're having to grind from nothing, working in factories and all this other stuff, right? And basically cheap labor, if not slaves, Irish slaves, actual slaves, right? And they were cheaper, right? They were cheaper than the African slaves because it cost more not only to go to Africa to get the slaves, but you had to pay more for the African slaves just in general. Then you could steal some people in England. That just makes logical sense. You could just take some people, some prisoners of war. You talking crazy about politics, about the Queen of England. Oh, we gonna take you, right? We gonna swipe you up. And that was happening a lot. Okay, that's what the pirates were doing. The Pirates of the Caribbean, that was human trafficking. It's all about human trafficking. It's not about black trafficking. It's about humans. We need to get you humans, right? Okay, and so they were the majority of the slaves. The indentured servants and the indigenous people in America, this is a whole other concept, so that's gonna be another book, but there was a lot of white slaves, okay? And they don't talk about white slaves. They had white slaves all throughout history. Matter of fact, the one drop rule was not for white purity. It was really so they can just keep having white slaves. Because all I gotta do is say, you got one drop of black blood and you a slave. You could be straight from Germany. You could be straight from Ireland. And they say, you black, you got one drop of black blood and I'm gonna have you be my slave. And black, that's enough, okay. Now, to the third book. I think it's called Black Slave Owners. I think it's just literally called Black Slave Owners. But I also did, there's a PDF that I really found that really blew my mind. And I didn't even think of the concept of black slave owners in America. This is something I just learned this year. This is just breaking down white supremacy in my head. Like I said, what is white supremacy? White supremacy is viewing whites as supreme. And having this overarching, even the idea that the elite value white people more than black people, which is not even the truth. It's just they value division. They value division. They just want us divided, fighting each other, right? So, and also there are black elites. When you have that freedom, when you realize there are black people and there have always been black people, matter of fact, the original elites were black people and they probably, most of them still are black people. That's some stuff y'all ain't ready for. Y'all not ready. Okay, so black slave owners. I have a PDF of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of black slave owners from the 1830s. Do you realize slavery ended in 1865? And in some places it ended in the 1830s? There's a long list, hundreds, probably thousands of black slave owners in America. They have the names. They have the states that these black slave owners were at.
This is the worst, the dirtiest secret in African American history, is that a surprisingly high percentage of the free Negroes in the South owned slaves themselves. And some of them owned, we explain it away by saying, oh, but they only own their mother, or they only own...
White supremacy. Because you can't imagine, right, because of the movies, because of the stupid history that we're talking, you can't imagine that black people were actually legitimate slave owners. Matter of fact, slave magnates.
They own their mother, they own their sister, they own their wife, and they own some other workers too. A surprisingly high number owned workers who they did not liberate throughout the South. There were enough black free Negroes who supported the Confederacy that they voluntarily formed a regiment in the state of North Carolina to fight for the Confederacy. And black Confederate troops are featured on the cover of Harper's Weekly in 1863. Frederick Douglass used this as an argument to make Lincoln allow black men to fight.
Wow.
Okay, slave magnates in South Carolina, slave magnates in New Orleans, slave magnates. That means you have 100+ slaves. Some of you black people have more slaves than George Washington. Hello? My first cousin, 10 generations back. Okay, so this is real. Like, you can look, this is something you can legit look up. Okay, that's another one. And that whole, just that whole concept really just like debunked white supremacy in my mind. When rocks cry out. I'll say when rocks cry out. When rocks cry out, that debunked white supremacy because it made it very clear, for one, that the people in the Bible were black, and for two, that a lot of the places that they were in the Bible was in the Americas. The Promised Land is in the Americas. Like, y'all not ready for that conversation, but Egyptians were originally in America, like in Mexico. They still have the pyramids. It's so wild. It's so wild. Why do they never talk about the pyramids in Mexico? Why do they never talk about the pyramids in Guatemala and the mounds in the Americas and the just sheer ancientness of some parts in America? Like, we think that this is a new world, right? And that's another part of white supremacy, I say, because by really ignoring the history of South America and ignoring the history of North America before colonial times, that's a form of white supremacy, because there's nothing but people that look like me, and there may have been light-skinned indigenous people, but they were not, that's not the narrative that they talk about at all. They don't talk about America before Columbus. I feel like if you truly understand the concept that, like, America is the promised land and that a lot of copper-colored people that look like me are the indigenous people of the Americas, then I can see how somebody can go all the way left, like they go from right to all the way left, but like from a center place, it's just like, it just dismantles, for me, it just dismantles white supremacy. And also, like, when you start to do your genealogy, it's just a matter of knowing that you can't look at a person and know what they are. You can't look at a person and know where they're from. Like, somebody can be white as snow, okay, and have a lot of ancestors that look like me. A lot. You can, it's just like, you look in their genealogy, and if they have pictures of all their ancestors in the family tree, you'd be like, what the hell? How did you come out looking like this? That kind of stuff, it just makes you just dismantle white supremacy. It's just like, you're not supreme. You're not below me, but you're not supreme to me. You know what I mean? So that's another book. That's number 4. I read another book called White Trash. And that book basically breaks down and makes it clear that white supremacy is not about white supremacy, right? It's not about white supremacy. It's not about the belief that white people are actually supreme. It's literally about division, right? And it talks about how they created the black versus white in America to divide the colonies, because during the Bacon's Rebellion, they revolted against white people, or the elite, which may have been black and white, which were likely black and white. And they started creating policies that gave white people certain privileges that black people didn't get. And so that created a sense of entitlement for the white people and a sense of oppression for the black people, to where they were fighting each other, when just before, when they were all had the same, you know, rights and privileges, they were together fighting who they should be fighting, which is the elite, right? And so it talked about how so many like medical experiences or experiments were done on white people, poor white people, how they were trying to sterilize poor white people, how, you know, just think about like during slavery times, what do you think poor white people were doing? Right? Like, they had no job opportunities, right? Like, unless they were a slave, which a lot of white people were slaves, they were squatters that were coming from other countries, right? And they didn't have their own land. They couldn't get work because work was already, people already was working, right? And they already trained. So what you gonna do, right? So they living off other people's land and constantly traveling all over trying to find somewhere to be, like find a spot to be in, right? So dirt poor. And if you like if you actually talk to white people, you will see that that is most white people's story. Like, their grandparents were dirt poor during the Great Depression. Everybody's grandparents was dirt poor, like a lot. Okay, and so that is another book that really dismantled white privilege and white supremacy, because white privilege is white supremacy, right? That's what it is, right? And it's a idea. And when you are not a white supremacist, a lot of things that people consider as racism, you realize it's really just, you have a, like, you are a white supremacist. Like, some of the things that people are like, this is, they get all these opportunities and blah, blah, blah. No. You know what I'm saying? Like, nah, I know how to manifest. I know how to raise my vibration. I know how to, you know what I'm saying? And even, like, I'm just not going to quit. I have an advantage. I have black privilege, right? I'm going to use my black privilege, right? I'm going to talk about that on another video. But no matter what form you come in, you can find privileges for yourself. And it's a good idea that you do. It's a good idea that you find the benefit in the you know, the assets that you have as whatever you are, whether you're a woman, whether you're a black woman, whether you're lesbian, it's good to do the history and the research so you can find out your assets. Right? So you use your assets, you know, use your assets. People, women out here nowadays, they just want to use their ass. No, use your assets. Find your assets and use them, right? And so, yeah, those are 5 books. I highly recommend reading it. I guarantee your mind will be blown after you read those 5 books. And I'll see y'all in the next video. Like, subscribe, comment, and I look forward to hearing what y'all have to say.